Greetings and welcome to Legacies of Wavryn, Lore of the Endelment. This will be chapter 13 of this reading. As we approached St. Louis, Missouri on the Poplar Street Bridge, we could see a small amount of smoke coming from the center of the city. There were several different military choppers circling the area, trying to fire down at something. We also noticed that there were 4 large military SUVs blocking the road from anyone trying to enter the area. Each had 4 soldiers standing around them. I stopped about halfway on the bridge and just revved my engine at them every so often. I was trying to see if they would catch me signaling them. After my first 2 quick revs, Zaec pulled up and stopped at the driver's side of my car to wait for a response. One of the soldiers aimed at me and fired a round near my left front tire, as if to scare me off. Some friendly service that was. Zaec took his helmet off and held it at his right side as he looked over at me and asked, "What should we do, bro?" Just then, one of the soldiers held up a megaphone and said, "Attention, you are entering a restricted area. St. Louis, Missouri is now the property of the military. Turn back now, or we will use deadly force." I looked over at my brother with a big sarcastic smile and asked, "Why don't we ask them?" Zaec gave his own smile and replied, "Okay." We then turned back to the blockade without emotion, while my brother yelled, "What's going on?" The soldier with the megaphone quickly said, "Classified." "Classified my ass," I said, revving my engine loudly 2 more times as Zaec put his helmet back on. All of the soldiers within the blockade quickly raised and aimed their guns at us, while the one with the megaphone yelled, "Stop what you are doing and turn back now or you will be destroyed." I laughed at that as I adjusted my glasses again. Then as I lowered my left hand, I said, "I'd like to see you try." I slammed on the accelerator as I rolled up my window, while my brother followed. Just as my tires began to squeal, the soldiers began to fire at us. However, as I got within 20 feet of them, they split apart and started firing at me from both sides, as absolutely pointless as that was. Knowing that I still wasn't going to stop, the soldiers ducked down as I broke through their SUV blockade and took off towards the city. Zaec looked back over his right shoulder at the units and moved his left hand under his right armpit just so he could flip them off. Once they were out of sight, he lowered his hand back onto his bike as he turned forward and continued to follow me. We drove around, trying to figure out where the choppers were striking at. Then we heard an explosion that was shortly followed by rapid bursts of gunshots. As we swung around a corner, we could see that the army was in combat, but we couldn't see with who or what it was, only a massive dirt cloud in front of them. All we could see were 3 of their ground carriers parked along the road, each with 2 tanks by their sides. I parked my car on the left side of the street next to the sidewalk and waited to think about what I was going to do. Zaec drove around and spun a 180 in front of me to park, pretending to be cool. "Who do you think they're fighting against?" Jewel asked. "It's not who are they fighting," I said. "It's what are they fighting for to me." Amber looked over at me and said, "What are you talking about? They're fighting not only to get rid of a possible threat, but to keep peace and freedom in our country." I looked over at her with a blank stare and bluntly said, "What peace? What freedom?" She just gave me an angry expression for a few seconds. Then I said, "Guess you figured those were rhetorical." I chuckled at that, while Wolf opened her door and got out to hold it open for the others. Amber jumped out and kicked the door against the light pole, which broke the pole out of the pavement slightly. At the same time, she yelled, "Fuck you, Zaec." She then slammed the door and continued, "Piece of shit." After seeing that, I started to laugh as I opened my door to step out. At the same time, Zaec tossed his bike helmet to the ground as he walked over to Amber to try and calm her down. I turned around to hold my door open for Jewel, while Wolf walked around the back of my car over to me. Jewel moved to sit just at the edge of her seat and looked up at me, irritated, as she said, "Thanks for pissing her off, Ray." Fox quickly leaped out in her full animal form before Jewel could get out, motioning to Wolf's right side and quickly changing back into her half state. Just as Jewel finally stepped out, I looked over at Wolf and Fox as they walked over to my left side. Wolf glanced over at Amber and asked, "You think she'll be alright?" I laughed, then replied, "Yeah, she's just having one of her periods." Wolf looked back and said, "That's not funny, my lord." I shut my door and looked back over at Zaec and Amber to see that she was gently wrapped in his arms as she complained about me. My brother tried to explain as to why I was the way I was, not really saying anything, and that once she'd been around me long enough, that it would be easier to tolerate me. Doubt it. I looked directly over at my brother, slightly confused, and asked, "What are you doing?" Keeping his attention on Amber to help calm her down, my brother replied, "Just being courteous, brother." He then looked up at me and said, "Sorry to ask of you this, but could you please be a bit more thoughtful with Amber and Jewel? They are humans, after all. They're not like us." I grew angry and squinted my eyes, then turned to the battle zone as I said, "Bite me." I then started off towards the fight as I quietly said, "Idiot." Once we were near one of the carrier vehicles, which had 2 soldiers hiding behind it as they shot out from around the ends every so often, Jewel looked up at the sky and asked herself, "What's up with the weather?" She then looked over at me and asked, "You know why the weather is acting like this?" I walked over to the first soldier, dark brown skinned and bald with golden eyes, and replied, "Nope." I then used my left hand to tap the soldier's right shoulder as I said, "Excuse me." Startled, the soldier looked over at me as he reloaded his rifle and yelled, "What do you want, punk?" He then cocked his rifle back and said, "This is a restricted area, so y'all need to leave." Just then, an energy blast came from the dirt cloud and struck the base of the carrier that he and his friend were hiding behind, flipping it over all of us. As the carrier passed over, the soldier quickly turned away from the vehicle as he yelled, "Whoa, shit!" The second soldier, white with inch-spiked blonde hair, yelled, "Hold your position." The carrier hit the ground upside down just 10 feet behind us as the first soldier turned back and knelt at his partner's left side. He then began to fire at the enemy again as he yelled, "We ain't got no cover." I kinda figured as much. Then what are we waiting for? Don't worry, just keep shooting. You crazy white boy. As the fight went on, I glanced around to try and find whatever it was that these soldiers were targeting. However, I couldn't see anything and couldn't sense any irregular power source. Afterwards, I looked over to my left at Zaec, which he looked over at me, and we both shrugged our shoulders. We then turned back to watch. None of us were affected by the combat. Quite amazing with Amber and Jewel, since this would most likely be their first time actually in battle. Of course, all we did was just stand around, as if it was just some simple street show. In fact, I found it funny when Amber yawned after a few seconds. Once he wasted a second clip, the first soldier quickly raised his left hand up and yelled, "Hold your fire!" It went real quiet, with nothing but the sound of the choppers above. Everyone just watched and waited to see what would happen, the dirt cloud disappearing to show a hole in the street about 100 yards away. It became that irritating silence to me that made me want to scream my head off. Combat silence can be almost as bad as... well, I guess I don't have to say it anymore. A minute passed, and the first soldier quietly said to his partner, "He said to fire until he had him pinned, regardless if we might have shot him. But this... something ain't right. Nothing's happening." He then bumped his partner's left side with his right elbow and said, "Go check it out, Marshall." Marshall glanced over at his partner and said, "You check it out, Carl. I ain't checking it out." "Now don't make me put my brand new big ass boots up your narrow ass. You always make me do stuff. Why don't you go out there and do something for once?" Carl looked over at his partner in anger and said, Because I ain't the one who's got nothing to lose, white boy. Oh yeah, right, Marshall said, looking over at his partner in anger as well. I have 2 dogs, a mother, and a little brother. Whereas you got nothing but a wife, someone who can easily move on. With that, the two stood as they continued to watch the area they were firing at, Carl still aiming down his sight, as he said, "Don't be a punk ass. The soldier lowered his weapon and turned to face my friends and me, then asked, "What the hell you guys standing around for?" In response, only I just shrugged my shoulders as if I had no idea. He then noticed my guns, then looked up at me and asked, "You got guns, white boy?" "Yeah," I said. "What about it?" "Don't be stupid, use them." The ground rumbled, getting the soldiers to turn back as they aimed at the hole. Then Carl glanced over at Fox. She just gave a light smile as she raised her right hand to wave at the soldier and said, "Hi." "Hey," he said. He then looked at his partner and asked, "Did either Yojin or Vincent say they were bringing backup?" Marshall lowered his rifle as he turned around and jumped slightly when he saw Wolf and Fox, then turned back to his partner and replied, "I don't think so." The ground rumbled again, yet I was still unable to figure out why, or what was going on. Then I asked, "Yojin's here?" "Yeah," Carl replied. "He was supposed to lure out a man that he was fighting with, but all that's happened was this." The soldier raised his left hand up slightly to point at everything around him, showing the damage to the city, and said, "Total destruction." Another rumble came as I glanced down at the ground and said, "So that's it." "What?" Marshall asked. "They're underground. That's why I can't sense them. I can't sense through inanimate objects that are too thick." I looked up at a business building that sat on the corner with the sidewalk to my right and raised Zane to point at it, while I said, "Bet you $10 that that building over there will collapse into the ground, and whoever Yojin is fighting will be thrown up out of the ground where it was standing." Carl looked over at the building and said, "I'll take that bet, and make it 50, white boy." With that, he yelled out to the other soldiers, "All eyes on the civil court." He then grabbed his radio and said, "Victor 1 and 2, lock onto the civil court." A woman on the radio replied, "Copy that. Standing by." Afterwards, everyone except Zaec and I turned and aimed at the court. Yet I wasn't entirely sure. We all stood there patiently for about a minute. Then one last rumble hit, and another explosion came from underground. The explosion collapsed the ground underneath the building across the street from the court to our left. As everyone turned to see the building fall into itself, another explosion happened, and something shot up out of the building. It headed down towards us and hit the ground 10 feet from my back right, where it slid underneath the pavement and became buried under one of the tanks. I motioned for Amber and Jewel to get back as Carl yelled, "What the hell?" "All personnel," Marshall yelled, "open fire on the cross building." Everyone, except my friends and I, fired at the area where the building collapsed, while I turned to look over my left shoulder and wonder about what the thing was that crashed. A few seconds passed, and I turned back at the building that collapsed as I yelled, "Cease fire!" Everyone stopped, and I walked up next to Carl and said, "I sensed something unusual, but it was only for a second." The soldier quickly slapped the back of my head with his right hand and yelled, "What the hell, fool?" He then turned to the court, pointing at it with his right finger, as he yelled, "You said it was that building where this shit was going to happen." After that, he turned back towards the other building as he lowered his hand to grab his rifle again. I adjusted my glasses and confidently said, "Minor miscalculation." "Yeah? Well, now you owe me a minor $50, plus another miscalculation of 100 for the shit you just pulled." "Okay," I said, uncaring as I shrugged my shoulders. A large piece of rubble came flying at me, with a large burst of dirt and dust from underground. I quickly roundhouse kicked the rubble with my right foot, crushing it to dust on impact. As I came around, I aimed Vince up at the area where the rubble was thrown, and fired 3 shots into the smoke. The blast sounded as if they hit something, but only a sinister chuckle came from the distance in reaction to it. I lowered my gun and watched as the smoke dissipated, revealing an unscathed Kexin. He wore black dress shoes, light tan dress pants, a black button-up shirt, and a light tan tie and suit jacket. His hair was oiled and combed back, while cut at his upper neck, with a light tan fedora placed on his head to cover his eyes slightly. From his attire, he didn't even need to dust himself off, standing with his feet together as he waited for us to make a move. "As you can see," Vincent said, having appeared from out of nowhere to my right, "we couldn't even get a scratch on this guy." As I kept my focus on the Kexin, I said, "The bastard must be strong to hold you off." "No doubt. Where's Yojin?" "What? You didn't see him? I thought he dropped in on you guys." On that note, I realized what that thing was that shot out from the building over us. And then I adjusted my glasses and thought, uh-oh. I heard the sound of the pavement breaking behind me, with Yojin picking up a tank as he yelled, "Eat this, sucker!" The tank flew just overhead towards the Kexin, which struck the man into a large pile of rubble that was once a building. Yojin motioned to my left and snapped his neck from side to side, while circling his shoulders a couple times. He then said, "Punk-ass bitch." I looked over to notice that he had shaved his head, then said, "Nice chrome dome, Yojin." "Shut it, white boy," he barked, quickly glancing over at me. My friend had completely shaved his head and marked the right side with 3 silver lines, each an inch long and a centimeter wide and spiked vertically. He turned back to the Kexin that was crushed and calmly said, "Felt like making a small change in my appearance." "How am I to tell if you killed another high-powered warrior, though?" He quickly turned to me, while pointing 2 of his right fingers to the right side of his head, where the stripes were, and yelled, "Read the marks, fool!" I looked over at Vincent, confused, and shrugged my shoulders, then looked to see the Kexin stand back up. Even after being struck by 80 tons of force, he was completely unharmed. Even his clothes were still clean. I tried to sense how powerful the Kexin was, but couldn't get a hint as I asked, "Why can't I sense this guy's power?" "He's a Kexin with the powers of a god." Impossible, I thought, but it does explain why I couldn't sense him earlier. Powers of gods can't be sensed with mortal abilities, which makes it impossible to tell if someone has them or not, especially if they've been stripped of their original powers. That means Yojin and Vincent don't know about me yet. The Kexin was just like Rufus, didn't have any powers of his own, which didn't make sense but meant only one thing: darkness. However, I still kept my powers when I gained darkness, so I still don't understand why they lost theirs. My friend quickly and briefly explained what was going on. Then the Kexin put his hands behind his back and said, "About time you showed up." He grabbed the fedora off his head with his right hand, placed it at his chest, and bowed slightly and continued, "My name is Del Endo Agus Tyran Hologo." As the Kexin raised himself, placing his hat back on, I squinted my eyes at him and realized who he really was. He was another. Staring at the Kexin, I said, "Great, an ancient survivor. Death." Unfortunately, I knew nothing of death, except for him being once an ancient. He was more of a servant for a dark and vile overlord, one worse than the King of Darkness. Funny enough, this creature was simply known as Anyumi. Anyumi was a pure being of darkness, thought to be Abyss itself. Though unproven to exist, Anyumi was believed to be a far greater threat than Shadow. Some figured Anyumi was the Endelment's true enemy, only to be recognized as the D-Minion. I don't recall the tales of Anyumi that well, nor of the D-Minion for that matter, but I'm sure they were immortal beings of some sort. All I knew was that, like demons, the word D-Minion meant evil being of hellish nature, a vile creature, And if so, Father was just right down that alley. Death straightened his tie, then said, "Now listen and listen well, Shero." He began to walk out onto the sidewalk as he continued, "I assume you're here, as are your friends, to kill me. Well, my dear boy, I assure you." He stopped just as he set foot onto the concrete and placed his left hand slightly out in front of him, palm up, while he continued, "Until you've learned to control your special gift, you cannot hope to even scuff up my shoes, let alone kill me, Endelment." Vincent and Yojin glanced at their friend, confused at what Death had called me. Then they looked back at the Kexan as they readied to fight. However, I stood unaffected by his words as I stared him down and said, "I don't know what loony thoughts you might have cooked up in that brain of yours, but I assure you, I'm no Endelment. So back down, or else I'll have you see what Abyss looks like from a different perspective." "Really? Then if not, let's have some fun." With his hands still out, Death's powers started to rattle the ground. Then as he raised his hands slowly, the ground shook harder, while pieces of rubble were beginning to float up. Once his hand was as high as his shoulder, he said, "Brace yourself, mortals." Death quickly raised his left hand into the air just above his head and clenched it tight into a fist. The pieces of rubble that he picked up were ground into dust, and a loud thunder came from his body, making a noise that came from the clouds seem like pathetic squeaks. Lightning started to strike from the sky around his body, but not one even came close to touching him. His aura became visible to the naked eye as translucent black, which spiraled up in a clockwise and jagged motion 2 feet high and 4 feet from around his body. To most people in Wavryn, any aura flaring above just a foot showed massive amounts of power for one to have. However, it had to be flaring off the body itself. Death's was only around him, as if it were a barrier. Yet still, he had a great amount of power to be able to do that. He lowered his fist as he closed his eyes. Then a second layer of his aura appeared and spiraled up in a counterclockwise and jagged motion. He then opened his eyes slowly, revealing them to be completely different from before. They had turned pitch black, with a dark purple ring that was a centimeter big and a centimeter away around each white pupil. There were also 8 pitch black foxtails that sprouted from behind him, with bits of his dark aura flaring off of them as well. The tails grew to an enormous size of 20 feet long, first stretching about 4 feet, and were constantly flailing around. The gravitational pull within a quarter-mile radius around Death increased by at least 4 times, slamming all except my friends and I flat onto the ground. Amber and Jewel were barely able to keep their footage, yet lucky enough not to join the rest of the pure-blood humans on the floor. Death looked between Amber and Jewel, then with a two-tone voice said, "Impressive. I would have never believed in my wildest dreams that even one human could withstand my aura pressure, let alone 2. Very impressive indeed." He reached into his suit's left inner pocket with his right hand, where he pulled out a pair of simple leather black gloves. As he put them on, I watched his tail swing back and forth and noticed something was wrong with them and his body altogether. Death looked over at me and said, "Yes, Shero, there is something wrong with me. I seem to have fewer similarities to Shadow on my body than one should have at my level. Too bad I've had this power for so long that I can use darkness at will, while keeping most of my original form." He then crossed his arms behind his back and tilted his head slightly over his right shoulder as he continued, "But do you know what happens once you get the 9th tail from your final transformation? It does something that some would call..." His 9th tail rose from behind him, with a body stuck at the tip of it and blood dripping from the pierced wound, while he ended with, "Vile." As I watched the 9th tail rise, I noticed the person that was stuck on it. It was Bunny. Struck straight through her heart, she was slightly twitching and gasping for air. Wolf screamed for her and tried to run towards to help, but was held back by Yojin and Fox. Death swung Bunny around and struck 3 of his other tails into her. Then he slammed her into the ground to the far left side of him. He motioned to raise her up again as he quickly pulled his tails out and started batting her around, as if she was a rag doll. I placed Zane and Vince back into their holsters, pulled my right fist back, and jolted for Death as I shouted, "Bastard!" I tried to strike, but was stopped by the layers of his aura about a foot away from his face. I was then quickly thrown back into the ground where I had stood. Death swung one of his tails in the air and tried to strike me with it, but it was thwarted by Vincent's pike as my friend jolted in front of me. Amber and Joel went to help hold Wolf back as Yojin and Fox tried to shoot a few energy blasts at Death. However, their attacks just struck the ground 3 feet before nearing the Kexan. As I tried to pick myself up, Vincent shot a large spiked yellow energy blast at Death, but it was easily thwarted by one of the tails. The blast was tossed aside and struck a random building far off to my right and exploded in a large dome shape that reached slightly over the city buildings. Death laughed, then said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know you all cared for her that much. Well, if you want her so badly, then here. Take her." Death stabbed Bunny one last time through her torso, where he slammed her into the ground near us. When his tail pulled away, his aura pressure stopped pounding on us as he said, "Please be advised, I'm not here to kill any of you. I'm only here to give you a warning, especially for you, Endelment, whether you like it or not." Just as I stood up, I tried to motion for an attack, but Vincent used his pike to halt my action as he said, "Let him speak, my lord. It's the best chance we got in getting out of here alive." Of course, I was pissed with that, but I had no other option. Death was clearly more powerful than all of us combined, and I wasn't going to lose because of my hatred. Death told me about how Father planned to bring his entire empire to Earth and conquer the planet. Along with that, not only had Father gained darkness, he could use it in a way that some figured made him truly invincible. However, it wasn't yet perfect. He still needed one more element to his powers in order for it to work properly. And if so, only one who could use the powers of a god could ever hope to defeat him. I guess there is always a catch to things. The Kexan also explained that he single-handedly created a secret society to wage one last war against the Empire. He called himself, and his followers, Sentinels. The society was created to protect those who cannot fight for themselves. Sentinels wish to protect others from Dominic's vile obsession for a bigger and powerful empire, all of whom are amazingly enough Kexans. After Death spoke of what I needed to know, he said, "I shall send one of my trainees, Algan, a Kexan, to help you in your journey, my lord, so that you may learn to control the dark powers that lie within you, possibly even your greatest powers." He then snapped his fingers and reverted his darkness back into his body. With that, he tipped his hat down as he turned away from me, while he spoke in his normal voice and said, "I am truly sorry for what I've done here today, but I figured a simple lecture wasn't going to suffice you as much as this had. And don't worry, she's obviously not dead." He walked off and waved his right hand in the air and said, "Good day to you, my lord, and good luck." I looked down at Bunny as Wolf ran up and held her daughter tight in her arms, slightly rocking back and forth. She was heavily crying over her daughter, who lay unconscious in her mother's arms, while Wolf said, Bunny, please be okay. I'm so sorry. Please be okay." Though she wasn't blood-related, Bunny was basically Wolf's child, and also my own. We found and raised Bunny ever since she was a month-old abandoned baby. We had always looked out for her, and did everything we could to help her. It must have been heartbreaking for Wolf to see her daughter like that, thinking that she might somehow be dead, and to know there was nothing she could do to save her. It was for me. We left the military to deal with the aftermath of the situation, seeing as we shouldn't have even been there to deal with it in the first place. It should have been a grab-and-go deal, but then death happened. The bastard's lucky that neither I nor Wolf went to go chase him down. Yojin and Vincent followed the rest of us back to Manhattan, because at this point, staying inside and doing nothing was the best option. All we could do was wait for another day. Back at the hotel, I walked over to my desk and got it to stand up as I fixed it back to normal with my powers. Once I did, I just sat back in my chair and went to sleep, uncaring of what everyone else was doing. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought, how dare Death call me that stupid Endelment thing? I should smack him with one hard fist next time we meet. But why does he want to help me? Why would he be willing to train and perfect my darkness abilities, let alone know that I will be able to control them? Especially if they're anything close to what fathers are. And even so, what good will it bring? Oh well. I just hope that Wolf and Bunny don't have any mental breakdowns. That's all I need. Having them start making things worse for me than they already are. It's a good thing I didn't lose my cool badass glasses. That would have sucked. I would have gone after Death if that were the case. This concludes the reading of Chapter 13. Thank you all for watching and listening. If you like what you've seen and heard, there will be a link to my physical works in the description below. With that being said, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you again next week, reading Chapter 14.